Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh or anywhere you get your podcast from. It's a Monday, which means we are getting into our Pittsburgh Penguins Power Rankings for Week 6 of the 2024-25 NHL season, and it's going to be a very fun one. Last week, there wasn't a lot of moves. There wasn't a lot of changes. But this week, we got a whole bunch. We have one player that has kind of snuck his way into the honorable mention spot. We got two players making their season debuts in the top 5. And spoiler alert, we have a brand new number 1 sitting atop the Penguins Power Rankings for week number 6. But let's kick things off with the two players that have dropped from the rankings between last week and this week. And first and foremost, it's the obvious one. Joel Blomqvist was sent down to the AHL because, well, Tristan Jarry is back from his conditioning loan. They need to get him back on the ice. They need to continue to get Alex Nedeljkovic time on the ice, and there just doesn't seem to be enough ice time to go around for the young rookie in Joel Blomqvist. He gets sent to the AHL. He's the last goaltender in the entire organization to play at the AHL level. A fun little tidbit there. And he's been pretty good. Obviously, the last thing we've seen of him now is going to be getting pulled last Monday against the Dallas Stars. But overall, I think it was a very successful debut stint with the Pittsburgh Penguins at the NHL level. Wouldn't be surprised if he finds his way onto these power rankings for years to come. But because he was sent down to the AHL, I am going to drop him for the rankings for the time being. Also dropped Noel Acciari. This is a guy that is going to be kind of bouncing around that 5 spot to out of the rankings. But I do think there is just a handful of players that have jumped him in this past week because, for the most part, that 5 to maybe 8 or 9 have all been pretty close all season. But 8, 9, and 10 have all jumped up for the first time this season. They deserve to be in my top 5. But before we get to that top 5, let's talk about my honorable mention, somebody who I have been very hard on all season long. Number 72, Anthony Beauvillier. 4 points, 2 goals, 2 assists in his 3 games played since moving back up to the first line alongside Sidney Crosby and Rickard Rakell. He's tied for second on the Penguins in goals with 6. And even before he went on this little stretch here since he got back up on the first line, I kept saying, yeah, he has the goals. He's played well in certain games, but he just disappears far too often. Well, at some point, yeah, you can't continue to ignore the fact that he is producing. He is tied for second on the team in goals. He does have over a point per game since moving back up with Sidney Crosby. So you got to give a little bit of love, a little bit of credit where credit is due. And Anthony Beauvillier has had himself a nice little run here since getting back on the top line with Sidney Crosby. And he's put together a half-decent season. I mean, already, I believe, close to, if not tied with, the amount of goals that he scored last season. And he was traded twice last year as a member of, well, the Nashville Predators, the Chicago Blackhawks, and the Vancouver Canucks. All of last year, he had 5 total goals. He has 6 on the young season here, just about a quarter of the way through. So you do have to give a little bit of credit to Anthony Beauvillier. And if you're the Penguins, you're hoping he can keep this up. Now, do you keep him if you get to the trade deadline and your team is far out of the playoffs? That's a discussion for another day. But you do need to give credit where credit is due. And Anthony Beauvillier, he's fine in the back of the net. He's finishing. He's scoring goals. And you can't be too mad whenever that's the case. But let's jump into the top 5 here. And for the first time all season, it's all forwards. I know there shouldn't be any surprise that there's no defenseman on this list, but with Joel Blomqvist bowing out for the first time all season, that opens the door for 5 forwards making the top 5 in the Pittsburgh Penguins Power Rankings, starting with Bryan Rust. Previously unranked, Rust clocks in at number 5. Simply put, the Penguins need him to stay healthy if they have hopes of doing absolutely anything this year. You came into this year knowing that he was likely going to be your number 1 winger. He was likely going to be the guy that can work with either Crosby or Malkin, no matter where everything else is shifting, right? If Michael Bunting's struggling and he has to get moved around, if Rickard Rakell's struggling and he has to get moved around, if Drew O'Connor's been struggling and he has to get moved around, Bryan Rust is the guy that you know you can put on any line and he's likely to succeed. The Penguins just need him to stay healthy because when he's been healthy, he's been pretty good this season. Maybe not defensively, but I think the same can be said for a lot of players on the Pittsburgh Penguins. Rust has looked good. He's looked particularly good since returning from his latest injury when he came up against the Washington Capitals. He has 5 goals, 2 assists in 13 games played, and he continues to be one of the key pieces to this Pittsburgh Penguins team. He's been putting it together the last week, and that's what pushed him over the line and got him into that number 5 spot. At number 4, I talked about this guy a lot last week. And when I say a lot, I believe I talked about him on every single piece of content that we put out at the tip of the iceberg. And that's Michael Bunting. Previously unranked, he was an honorable mention last week. He makes it into the list, debuting for this season at number 4. 19 games played, 3 goals, 3 assists, and on the surface, doesn't look impressive, probably because it's not impressive, especially because he had 1 point in his first 12 games played. But since then, 5 points in his last 7, 3 of them being goals. He continues to build game after game after game. He's playing well alongside Evgeni Malkin. He's showing that he can be that bona fide top 6 winger that he was late last season with the Pittsburgh Penguins. And he's being a lot more of what they needed him to be down in that net front, down between the whistles. And I think that's exactly what you want to see from Michael Bunting. So talked about him a lot last week, and that gets him an opportunity to get into the top 5 this week, ranking at number 4. Number 3, no change between last week and this week. Again, for a long time, as far as non-goaltenders are concerned, it was Crosby, Malkin, Rakell. The Penguins' first line, and then the bottom 9. It wasn't working anywhere else, but that first line was performing well, and Rickard Rakell was a huge part of that, and that's why he built up a lead in front of Michael Bunting, in front of Brian Rust, in front of Anthony Beauvillier. That lead has shrunk, but not enough for me to take Rickard Rakell out of the top 3. So he stays at the number 3 spot. In 20 games played, he has 6 goals and 5 assists, and this is what I mean by that lead has shrunk. Held off the score sheet, goals, assists, all included in the last 6 games played. The Penguins need him to kind of get back on the horse because he got off to a red-hot start to the 2024-25 season. He's still performing well, but he just needs to be able to find that score sheet a little bit more consistently. He needs to end this cold streak and this drought to be able to get back on the score sheet and help the Penguins get back on the winning side more often than not, because they've been on the losing side pretty often here over the last handful of weeks. Number 2, and this is where the biggest switch up of the week happened. Number 2 is going to be Evgeni Malkin. For the first time all season, since week 1 of these power rankings, he held on to this for over a month. Evgeni Malkin is no longer in the top spot in my Pittsburgh Penguins power rankings. His 5-on-5 play has dipped a little bit. He's still coming up in big moments. Look no further than the shootout winner against the San Jose Sharks. But defensively, boy, they're leaving a lot to be desired. We understand Evgeni Malkin's never going to be a Selke candidate, but he's got to be better than what we've seen in the last handful of games. 5-on-5 play, like I mentioned, has dipped a little bit, but he's still performing well. He's still, in my opinion, top 2 on the Pittsburgh Penguins right now. And I think that there's just been a little bit more for my number 1 to finally surpass Evgeni Malkin. I think he's been hot on his tail the last couple of weeks. And this past week, it was just enough for me to finally switch the focus, finally switch who's at number 1, and put Sidney Crosby in his rightful place at number 1. If you would have asked me before the season, when do I think Sidney Crosby would have been at number 1, I would have said probably in week 1, and he probably would have held on to it for more weeks than not. If you would have told me then that week 6 of doing these power rankings would be the first time Sidney Crosby is at number 1, I would have said, you've lost your damn mind. But that ends up being the case because Evgeni Malkin got off to a hot start. Sidney Crosby got off to a super slow start. But since Crosby has turned it on, he's absolutely turned it on. He has points in 8 of the last 10 games played. In those games, he has 12 points, 6 goals, 6 assists, and has totaled 19 points in 20 games played this season, 7 of those being goals. He leads the team in goal scoring to this point in the season. Because of that, he's going to go up to the number 1 spot in my Penguins power rankings. So there you have it. Honorable mention, Anthony Beauvillier. Nice to talk about him on a Monday. Didn't know if I'd get to do that all season long. Brian Rust goes in at number 5. Michael Bunting clocks in at number 4. Rickard Rakell sticks it. Oh, no, sorry. He went up one spot. He was at number 4 last week. So sorry about that. Lied. Rickard Rakell up one spot to number 3. Evgeni Malkin bounces down out of the top spot for the first time all season to number 2. But Sidney Crosby is the one that takes over the number 1 spot in the Penguins Power Rankings. Should be an interesting week to see if any defensemen can climb up into there. I find it hard to believe. I don't think any of them are anywhere close at this point in time to getting into my top 5. And goaltending-wise, ditto. So this might be the new normal for a handful of weeks. A lot of forwards. Now, whether or not that's Nola Jarry climbing back into this, whether or not it's Blake Lizotte coming back from his concussion and climbing into this, whether or not it's a young guy, maybe Vasily Ponomarev, maybe a Sam Poulin, maybe Drew O'Connor turns it around and gets into this. No matter what, though, right now it's feeling like it's being dominated by the forwards, and that's just how things go when you're one of the worst defensive teams in all of hockey. But that's going to do it for this episode of The Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Let me know in the comments, who's your top 5 6 weeks into the 2024-25 season? Who do you have at number 1? Is it Crosby? Do you keep Malkin there, or is there somebody else? I'm interested, I'm intrigued, and I want to hear your opinion. So leave those in the comments below. But that's going to do it for this one. We'll see you guys next time.